Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Displays of Belonging with Sarah Ellen Zarrow. Before we get started, a few housekeeping details. Your audio and your video will be off throughout the program. You may send us your questions via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you refrain from comments and keep questions short so we can try to get to everyone's questions this evening. Sarah Ellen Zarrow is an associate professor of history at Western Washington University, where she holds the Endowed Professorship in Jewish history. Her ongoing research focuses on Jewish life in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland. And I'm happy to add that Sarah is a Yiddish Book Center alum. Welcome, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I am an alum and I'm very far away geographically, but the Yiddish Book Center has a place in my heart. So I'm so happy to be here today. I'm here to talk about my recent book, and I'd love to share some slides, if everyone will bear with me. Great. All right. I assume that that's visible. Please tell me if it's not. I'm here to talk about my recent book and some of the themes in it. It traces the development of the establishment of Jewish museums in Poland up until World War II. And I'll start with a little bit about how I came to this particular topic and offer a little bit of historical background, and then get into a few sketches of some of the collectors and the museum creators that I discuss in the book and their work. I also have some kind of general observations, and I'll be really happy to take some questions and get into discussion at the end. So my research my research in earnest started when I found a letter in the archives. In March of 1938, from Lviv, Poland, the banker and art collector Maximilian Goldstein sent Adolf Hitler a copy of his book, The Culture and Art of the Jewish People in Polish Lands, writing that his book demonstrated both his own loyalty to what he called his polnischen Heimat, his Polish homeland, and also the contributions of the Jews to the high culture of Poland. He wrote in his letter, "I dare to lay my life's work in your favor, to be seen as a contribution to culture and also to the Jewish question." So, whoa. What on earth made Goldstein think that Jewish artistic contributions could have any impact on Hitler's policies, on Hitler's plans? What were other ways in which Jewish art and cultural production were instrumentalized for political purposes, or in what ways did they function as entries into a political conversation? This is where I began. I'll talk about Goldstein, I'll talk a bit about Lviv a bit more in a few minutes. I think it's a good idea to pause briefly to give a tiny bit of historical background. Forgive me if this is old hat for some of you, I'm sure it is, for others maybe not. Before World War I, this is what the so-called Polish lands look like. You can see that Poland, of course, was partitioned between neighboring empires. I've put Lemberg there because it said Lviv, but I'll be referencing Lemberg, Lviv, Lviv, in Galicia, the Austrian partition of Poland. This is where Goldstein was writing from. Lemberg was in fact the regional seat. I'll also be talking about museum in Warsaw, and I think briefly mentioning Krakow as well. One of the questions I tackle in the book is how the establishment of the Second Polish Republic after the First World War affected Jewish museum development. The establishment of the Second Polish Republic in November 1918, immediately following the First World War, changed the lives of the new state's 27 million residents in multiple and profound ways. And among those residents, the country's nearly 3 million Jews, who formed the largest Jewish community of any country in Europe, the second largest in the world after the US, were faced with the challenge of finding a place for themselves in a state that often defined itself as a creation of the ethnic Polish nation, which excluded Jews. And I start my book by talking about Jewish ethnographers based in Warsaw around the turn of the 20th century. These ethnographers, I would say, laid the groundwork for some of the ways in which Jews were presented in museums, and sometimes they were also collectors themselves. I'll talk mainly about one today. A Jew reading the Polish language Jewish press in Warsaw in the 1890s might well have come across an editor's plea for information about his own life, his beliefs, his customs, questions about these beliefs and customs of Jews in Polish lands in Warsaw and what they termed the provinces, in addition to ethnographic tidbits, began to appear regularly in the Polish language Jewish press around this time. Readers of these periodicals could learn about Yiddish sayings, for example, about common Jewish superstitions. They also encountered calls to contribute their own entries to ethnographic research on Jewish life in Polish lands, again, especially in what they termed the provinces, meaning the kind of the non-urban Polish lands, especially outside of Warsaw. It also has a little bit a connotation of like in the sticks. In the 1890s, a professional and also semi-professional corps of ethnographers developed out of this community of the Polish language Jewish press. Warsaw Jews and non-Jewish ethnographers, both formally trained and avocational, increasingly saw Jews in the provinces as worthy research subjects. In some ways, they were like local others, akin to people in far-off lands. They're often referencing Africa. And in the Polish language Jewish press, these researchers put forward kind of formal programs for researching Jews. As integrated Jews, as Jews who had left the provinces about which they were writing behind for life in the city, Warsaw's Jewish ethnographers writing in Polish felt the need to distance themselves a little bit from their kind of quote unquote exotic or backwards Jewish brethren. Some of this impulse undoubtedly derived from this urge to be seen by non-Jewish Poles as part of the intelligentsia, and also potentially a little bit of embarrassment about their own provincial origins. Wisła, which you can see on the left there in a scan, an ethnogeographic monthly founded in Warsaw in 1887, issued the very first call for research on Jewish customs and life in Polish lands. The following year, the ethnographer Regina Lilienthalova, whom you can see her photograph there, began publishing in Wisła. Eventually, she became the main contributor to a regular Jewish folklore column. There's a lot to say about her writing. She was very interested in the treatment of women and children in Jewish society. But since I'm focusing really on museums today, I'll just note one item from her collections, which she donated, which I'll talk about, to a museum. There's a bit of a story here, I think, also, which is really indicative of the fate of many objects in Jewish collections and museums in Poland. So this is a photograph, obviously, of baked goods. These are stamped baked goods that were made for the holiday of Purim. They're part of Regina Lilientalova's collection. They were most likely donated by Lilientalova herself to the Museum of Industry and Agriculture in Warsaw, which later became Warsaw's Ethnographic Museum. They're also depicted in one of her books, Jewish Holidays in the Past and Present. But the photographer here, she didn't, it's her collection, but she didn't take the photograph. The photographer was Arvad Schultz, who was a German ethnographer, who was part of the German occupying authorities in 1916. So he photographed these items as part of this kind of German ethnographic research in Poland, so kind of 1 degree removed from the ethnographers I'm writing about. And this photograph is now in the collection of Krakow's Ethnographic Museum. The original breads are not with us anymore. They're either destroyed in the later course of World War I, or in the interwar, or perhaps in World War II. But I think just the story of these breads, of this photograph, show, I think, some of the twisted trajectory of some of the objects in these collections and museums. So we can talk a little bit more of these collectors, on whose collections the Jewish museums were based. Who were they? I'll try to speak both in general terms and also to give some really concrete examples. Very often, collectors were from families that were termed assimilated. They sometimes called themselves assimilated or assimilators. Others called them that as well. I think that For us today, the term isn't super helpful as it really connotes Jews with little connection to organized Jewish communities. Scholars tend to use acculturated or integrated as ways of describing these Jews now, and especially because many of them were actually highly involved in their Jewish communities. They were just also speaking Polish in daily life and interacting with non-Jewish worlds to a large extent. Many of the collectors I write about came from similar milieus to these ethnographers. These collectors of Jewish art, culture, and folklore were primarily integrationists. They were members of Jewish religious communities. They wanted to promote Jewish life and culture. They had no interest in full assimilation, but they were educated mainly in Polish. Those who had children sent their children to Polish language schools, and they were steeped in general Polish culture. They had strong business and social ties to Polish Catholic neighbors and really wished to fully integrate into Polish culture and society. What did they collect? Why did they collect? And why then make a museum out of private collections? They're all slightly different questions, but they're all related. I think that for many collectors, collecting Jewish art and objects is a natural growth, either of kind of a family heritage or interest in arts and crafts broadly. For example, Maximilian Goldstein, whom I mentioned earlier, who we'll talk about more, was a coin collector. And within his collection, he had some coins with Hebrew writing on them, ancient coins, but he was also interested in numismatics generally. The doctor Marek Reichenstein, who was also in Lviv, was an avid collector of book art, not just Jewish, but including Jewish books, among other things. Collectors tended to come from families with some wealth, usually one generation of wealth, although not always. Often families who are connected both to official Jewish communities and also to state or municipal institutions of one kind or another. So for example, we could look at Matthias Berson, whose collection turns into a museum, which we'll talk about. He came from an observant family that was in industry. He himself was in banking. All of the members of his family were involved in philanthropy, especially, but not only, within the Jewish community. One of the main children's hospital in Warsaw is named for that family. Berson was particularly interested in wooden synagogues. The drawing on the right is from a publication of his. He wrote a thesis on the wooden synagogues of Poland. And he wrote about how traditional Jewish communities weren't, he thought, really concerned with preserving artistic heritage. They were, what he said, innately conservative. They were not necessarily interested in the artistic or heritage goals. It's a somewhat scathing statement. It's meant negatively, but I also think it shows how Berson was situated between the traditional and the modern. There's something about that kind of foot in both worlds nature of integration that means you value your community's artistic production, and you also see this broader value to it. Berson also noted that Poland was, as he put it, until now an inaccessible, almost exotic country, echoing some of the sentiments of the Warsaw ethnographers that Jewish life in quote unquote the provinces was more foreign to Warsaw's Jews than lands in Africa as well. Berson petitioned the Jewish Community Council in July 1905 to open a museum based on his collection of more than 1,000 objects. He had already donated portions of his collection to the National Museum in Krakow, to the Society for the Encouragement of Fine Arts in Warsaw. It was only at the end of his life that Berson chose to reorient his artistic donations to the Jewish community. I think partially because of the suspicion that they might not care for them properly. Although previously he had supported other Jewish communal endeavors quite a bit. In September of 1905, the Jewish community, the Kahila, officially approved the opening of the Museum of Jewish Antiquities from the bequest of Matthias Berson. The original name, which is kind of long, doesn't really stick. It becomes known as the Berson Museum or the Jewish Community Museum. Majority of contributions came from Berson and from his kind of circles of integrated Jews. Some of the items he donated included 17th century ketubas, marriage contracts, mainly from Italian lands, a medal in honor of Dona Gracia Mendes Nasi, who was born into a family of Portuguese conversos and became one of the wealthiest Jewish women of the Renaissance, a benefactress and an early woman printer. And the founder, neither of these have to do with Poland, although many of the other objects he has do. The founders envisioned this museum as the main museum for Jewish art and culture and the most important Jewish museum in Polish lands. The opening of the museum was delayed for some time. Berson's donation had to obtain Russian approval, and the 1905 revolution also delayed progress on the museum. Why did Berson make a museum with his collection rather than leaving it in his will to his children? It's possibly because his children got themselves baptized. They converted out of Judaism. Whether or not passing his Judaica along, which was a fairly large portion of the collection, was punishment for that act, or was it just practical? They have no need for it now, is a little bit unclear, but that was interesting to me. In this case, the commitment to the Jewish community actually outweighing a potential family commitment. So again, why collect at all? I think that varies, but I can identify a few things. One, of course, is aesthetics and taste, which I'm hesitant to remark on that much. But why does one person collect stamps and other book art? But other than that, most collectors I look at whose collections turn public or semi-public were interested in objects and sometimes also documented and also documents that detailed some aspect of Jewish history vis-a-vis the state. Marek Reichenstein, for example, who I mentioned in Lviv, had a collection of ketubas, also Italian ones. He seems to have been particularly interested in these as an example of ritual art produced by an acculturated, integrated community. Others had portraits of known figures in the Jewish community. Matthias Berson had an engraving of a unit formed during the 1830 November uprising that accepted Jews. That is not in this image here, but you can see some of the other objects that his collection housed. I think of particular note here for what I'm talking about is the one on the lower left, the candelabra with the Polish eagle. Some collectors, Goldstein in particular, were also interested in naive, quote unquote, naive art or folk art, although the actual exemplars of that were often produced by known artisans. As for creating institutions, it's a slightly different question, deeply tied up in this idea of integration. Will Jews develop parallel institutions to national or municipal ones? The National Museum in Krakow, for example, or some of the national galleries, just ones that center Jews, or will they choose a different route? Beginning in the late 19th century, Jews in Polish lands demonstrated their belonging to their civic communities through the creation of Jewish museums. And at first, I think the idea is a little bit paradoxical. How can belonging to a different nation, a different ethnicity, be demonstrated by an overt display of Jewishness? However, it's precisely, I think, through the appeal to this multicultural nature of this quote unquote host nation that Jews were able to demonstrate that they too could take part in this kind of national civic spirit in the civic life of the nation. They also had artists. They could contribute to the nation's cultural richness. Jews have contributed to the artistic heritage, cultural wealth of Poland. They have been Polish patriots alongside ethnic Poles. These were the things that these museums were intended to demonstrate. And to be clear, many non-Jews in the art and museum world saw this. Many curators and conservators understood this. So we can see again, this spread here with these images is from a sort of a general interest publication that's talking about the value of the museum, how interesting it is, how wonderful the collection is. In some cases, Jewish objects had already been displayed in national museums. This was the case in Krakow. The National Museum had a Judaica collection, part of which was based on a donation from Berson, but part of which wasn't. Since the 1880s, Warsaw's Museum of Industry and Agriculture had this small Jewish collection. That was the collection to which Lilian Talova donated. But in many sources pertaining to museums' founding, where the idea of building a museum is first discussed, there's this explicit presumption. No one really understands the contribution of Jews to Polish society. Therefore, we need a museum to demonstrate that. It's a little bit puzzling because it's clear that there already is this interest. It seems paradoxical, but on some level, it's certainly true. There was interest from non-Jews in the art and museum worlds. Your average non-Jewish Pole wouldn't necessarily be interested, but also on kind of the other hand, Jews and non-Jews didn't necessarily understand those contributions. Berson, who had excoriated the Jewish community as somewhat uncouth when it came to preservation and display, was really not the only one who noticed this. And this is, I think, a little, for what it's worth, it's a smaller version of what happens in a national museum, which really rose in popularity in Europe in the 19th century. Those were designed for visitors, like look at our wonderful national culture, but also for nationals themselves, look at our culture and learn it and produce it yourself and take pride in it. I'd also note that it's almost never made clear how these museums should do their work, right? Now museum education is a real field, and any larger museum you visit, there's a huge effort to write narratives on panels on the walls to appeal to different visitors, etc. It's not really the case in the museums that I'm writing about. It's possible that some of the exhibits had more text than I found, but I really think that the amassment of objects themselves, like these cabinets of curiosities, was supposed to be inspiring. The value of the objects was supposed, I think, to be evident. It's hard to parse that from written sources, but that's what seems to be the case to me. So we can go back to Maximilian Goldstein and his collection and his ideas. In Lemberg, Maximilian Goldstein co-founded the Society for the Lovers of Jewish Art in 1910, which aimed to support young Jewish artists. And his concern with youth really extended beyond the support that he hoped the Society for the Lovers of Jewish Art would provide. He published an open letter in a few publications urging young people to photograph local historical monuments, buildings, local people, collect folk songs and anecdotes, and he wanted to organize an exchange. If they sent material to him, he promised, exhibit it in what he called a European museum to be created in Lemberg. So this is the first mention of this planned museum. So it's a European museum, which I think is important. He viewed Europeanness as central to Lemberg Jews' identity. He himself had spent years in Vienna. He was also familiar with Jewish museums further west. So the idea of being European and therefore cosmopolitan contrasted sharply with an idea of the Jewish ghetto. So I'll show a few items from his collection so that you can get a sense of what exactly interested him, what his collection looked like. These are two items we might consider folk art, special bread made for a wedding, a grager. Both are from East Galicia, the region surrounding Lviv. The grager is probably 18th century. We also have a machine used for lace making, Spanier-Arbeit, a traditional craft amongst women in Galicia. On the right is a nutcracker engraved with the name Moshe, probably the name of the owner or a child. And finally, we can also, These are just some of the items in Goldstein's collection showing a range of his artistic interests, from decorative art, pieces for use in synagogue, household objects, all came from Galicia, the former Habsburg partition of Poland. Jumping forward in time a little bit, the Society for the Lovers of Jewish Art mounted a small exhibit in the Jewish Community Buildings Hall in 1920. This is an image from the cover of the printed catalog. The exhibit coincided with Hanukkah, and there were numerous mentions of lost freedom in the catalog, which pertains both to kind of the historical idea of the holiday of Hanukkah, but also about Poland's recent independence, kind of linking these struggles for independence and sovereignty together. He borrowed the phrase "not yet dead" from what would become the Polish anthem. The lyrics are older, but in this case, it was Jewishness that is not yet dead. Eventually, as discussion about the creation of a museum stretched on, no museum was built. The Great War intervenes, obviously. Goldstein had to table his plans for a museum. It wasn't until 1925 that the idea was resurrected. In that year, an architect named Józef Awin established the Commission for the Preservation of Jewish Art. Commission members revived plans for the museum, which had been dormant. The professor at the Faculty of Law at Jan Kazimierz University chaired the commission, and he was also very involved in the civic life of interwar Poland. He also had an interest in ethnographic topics. He had studied Jewish nicknames and done some ethnographic research of his own in his hometown of Rzeszów. The Commission for the Preservation of Jewish Art mounted an exhibit in 1928 in which Goldstein participated as well. So these are some of the examples of the works on display. As you can see, there are photographs, there are drawings. You also see part of this collection of ketubas from Italy. Until a few years ago, this collection in particular was considered lost, perhaps destroyed by the Nazis, until it was found rolled up in a stack of newspapers in one of Livy's art museums. All of these collections have really interesting afterlife, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A period if it's interesting. The would-be museum's temporary exhibit of Jewish books, ceremonial objects, and marriage contracts really constituted the first step in creating a permanent home for a collection in Lviv. As a section of the Lviv book exhibit, which was held in May and June of 1928, this Jewish-specific exhibit was open to the public in the Jewish community building. There are various books as well as ornaments to decorate the Torah scroll that were exhibited. And that exhibit proved that there was indeed an audience for a Jewish museum in Lviv amongst Jews, but also amongst non-Jews. Furthermore, the exhibit set the tone for a future museum. And in 1930, Marek Reichenstein, whose collection of ketubas this was, chaired a Society of Friends of the Jewish Museum. And it aspired to, quote, care for the Jewish cultural monuments of art and spread knowledge of Jewish art in society. They really wanted to create a central museum, a central Jewish museum within Poland. If you'll recall, Warsaw also wanted this. One of the things that emerged in the course of my research was really this competition between cities to have the best, the most European, the largest, most modern Jewish museum, the central museum. The next major step in the construction of a museum in Lviv came in 1933 with the publication of a temporary catalog of the nascent museum's holdings. The Municipal Museum of Artistic Industry, so this is a non-Jewish institution, exhibited the works. Previously, that museum had held successful exhibits of Hutzul art, a Polish-Ukrainian minority, Armenian art, both minority groups, and the museum director, Kazimierz Hartleb, his introduction to the catalog really implied that it was thus only natural to exhibit the treasures of another minority with a long history in Poland and the region. Hartleb saw the exhibit as a first step towards something that would take into account like the entirety of the Second Polish Republic that would be mounted in Warsaw, which doesn't materialize. We have a number of objects displayed in that collection. Again, ritual objects, another collection of groggers, some Esther scrolls, tzedakah boxes, menorahs, etc. Most came from historically Polish lands, although the catalog also listed Russian, German provenance for others. And the catalog, along with a glimpse of the objects displayed, it contains a note on the scholarly importance of the publication. They noted that the list of objects was created on this really scientific basis. It will serve as an outstanding example for further efforts and work in the area. And the emphasis placed on this concept of like rationality and order seen in museum exhibits and presentations of folklore really still, we see that before the First World War, we see it between the wars as well. Many of the original goals set forward from that Commission for Jewish Art and the Society of Friends could not be carried out for financial reasons. Additionally, between when these goals were laid out in around 1930 to the time the museum actually opens in 1934, the climate for Jews in Poland had really worsened considerably. Many Polish politicians, especially the anti-Semitic right, were talking about forcing Jews to leave Poland. There's increased street violence, talk of, although not action on curtailment of Jewish enrollment in Polish universities. Here we have a photograph of the opening of the museum. The architect, Józef Awien, who had been the founder of the Commission for the Preservation of Jewish Art, spoke at the museum's opening ceremony. In addition to explaining the basis for the museum's collections, he linked it to other Jewish museums in Frankfurt, in Berlin, Vienna, Breslau, as well as in Cincinnati, demonstrating the place of this local museum amongst the most famous institutions of Europe and also the US. The museum was never housed, unfortunately, in its own building. It was placed in the offices of the Jewish community on the second floor of a three-story building. This was mostly due to financial reasons, but commission members continued to discuss whether to move the museum until at least 1938. They simply couldn't come up with the money to prepare a standalone building to house the collections. In one meeting, the president of the Jewish community, Victor Hayes, appealed to a potential donor to put up the money for such a building. And for those of you who are in the museum world or in philanthropy or in not-for-profits, this something will seem very familiar here. His appeal demonstrated both the importance of the Polishness of the museum and also how it was supposed to function as a civic institution, not just as a Jewish one. And he said, having our own building was supposed to have colossal importance, both on the inside and the outside, to non-Jews. The museum opened as and remained the most beautiful cultural institution in Lviv and demonstrated the high cultural and artistic value of Lviv's Jewry. He then went on with his appeal. The museum should have its own building for the occasion of the 600th anniversary of the unification of Lviv with Poland, which was in 1340. So 1940 would be the commemoration. There were certainly other dates the museum could have chosen to commemorate, but they chose to link the museum's expansion to the broader non-Jewish public to the expansion of Poland itself and to the history of Lviv. So we can return a little bit to Goldstein. In the end, he didn't donate his collection to the Jewish Museum in Lviv. There are various theories about why that is, but he didn't lose sight of his original aims. He published a catalog of his collection in 1935 and called it The Culture and Art of the Jewish People in Polish Land. So this is the cover of the book on the left. On the right is his bookplate designed by the Polish Jewish artist Artur Szyk. Like the museum commission, Goldstein maintained a belief in the intercessory power of collecting Jewish art in Poland. And I mentioned, of course, earlier, Goldstein's kind of shocking, I thought it was shocking at the time, at least, letter to Hitler. He seems to be a really extreme case, of course, but I think that especially for Jews in Galicia, I think that this intercession between Jewish communities and the authorities, Stadlonis or Stadlonut, was still really valued. So what happened to these museums? I'll conclude with a few remarks about this, although there's more to say. Even as Jewish museums in Poland were met with real interest and support from many non-Jews, they never really gained the traction they thought. This is also part of their story. The museums were of interest to Jews and non-Jews, but really only people already interested in art or Judaica, and that's actually a fairly small group, it turns out. It's very hard to tell what the impact or influence was on the general Jewish or non-Jewish Polish population. Jewish communities often did not devote the necessary resources to keeping museums opened and professionally maintained. Some, like the museum in Warsaw, were only open a few hours every day. The well-known historian Meyer Bauerban wrote frequently in the press that Poland's Jewish museums were suffering from a number of maladies. For one, as he wrote, we, Polish Jews, gathered ourselves late for this work. We began to save our historical monuments only meanwhile, as the majority of them has been exported abroad if they didn't wilt in the country. In almost every city or state museum in Polish lands, there are known countless Jewish artifacts, but they were collected in seriousness only at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. So he regrets that Poland is sort of late to the game there, as he puts it. And while the First World War had spurred many Jews' interest in collection and displaying Judaica and Jewish folk art, and it also spurred a race to sell objects abroad. And this, to Bauerban, was a kind of another embarrassment for Poland, not just for its Jewish communities. And Bauerban also stressed the need for a central Jewish museum and archive of Poland's Jews. And of course, Warsaw would be the natural center, but Lviv's Jews would certainly not stand for that. And we know also that in Krakow, many Jewish institutions were really devoted to collection and display and wanted to make themselves these central institutions. They came to this endeavor in Krakow slightly later. And so I have many fewer images to show you from Krakow. A central museum was not really a realistic possibility by certainly the end of the 1930s. The museum's collective fortunes ebbed and flowed. At one point, the Warsaw Museum received an influx of cash. It published a catalog in the very late 1930s, but the interest from Jewish communities beyond these real boosters was never sustained for long enough. And if I may, I want to read one paragraph from the conclusion of the book before I wrap up that speaks to the kind of possibilities that Jewish museum creators felt for their museums and what might have happened. The Jewish museological project in Poland was a majority elite activity, does not seem to have attracted much notice beyond intellectuals and civic elites, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. Any talk of museums failure, and I am still not convinced that this term has any utility, should focus on failures among potential Jewish audiences. Rather than focusing on failed initiatives and failed Jews, I think it is useful to imagine the world that might have been had these collectors, ethnographers, patriots, communal activists, and civic activists not been pushed to emigrate, forced to flee, or murdered. We would see Jewish collectors arguing with one another as part of a vibrant and contested art and museum world, with promotion from non-Jews who also recognize the importance of historical Jewish artifacts, especially objects rescued from communities decimated by the First World War. We would see celebrations of Jewish museum openings in city halls and patriotic celebrations in synagogues. We would see Jews working out their place in Poland among many other minorities, which sometimes would lead to animosity, but other times to cooperation. We would see Jewish youth participating in patriotic explorations of their country as Poles and as Jews. And we would see Jews shaping and shaped by a multicultural Poland. And so that's where I end the book, as a kind of reflection on, not necessarily on demise or decline, but rather on the potential future that these museum creators and collectors envisioned, in which they thought, to a certain extent at least, they could will into life through their activities. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm eager to have a short discussion, answer any questions, show more slides.
Thank you, Sarah. It's such a fascinating and I think little known story. So thank you for surfacing this. All right, so we have questions. How did you become interested in this subject?
Thank you. Yeah, I was, since I started my graduate education, I was very interested in general sort of Jewish art and culture. As I said, I was a fellow at the Yiddish Book Center. I was interested in literature, the worlds depicted in this literature. And when I started graduate school, and I won't name the year, but there was a real research, like there was sort of an outpouring of scholarship on Szymanski and his expeditions and folklore collections and some of these other folklore collections. And I was really interested in reading all of that. And I became interested in whether we could see any evidence for similar projects in lands, further west, right? So Habsburg Poland rather than Russian Poland rather than the Pale of Settlement. And that's where it really began. So I started my archival work looking in places where I knew there had been Jewish museums. And that's what really brought me to Lviv. I knew that there was this collector, that there was a museum, and that's when I started looking through his papers. And that's when I found that letter, showed it to a friend of mine, also a historian, and she said, this is your project.
And it was a really good direction to go in. Was there a Jewish museum in Rivne?
This
Rovno, it's spelled two different ways.
I do not believe so. There are some of the items in the collection in Lviv may come from there. I would have to look back at the catalogs. In general, the museums were a much more large city operation. The ones I treat in the book are in Lviv and Warsaw and Krakow and Vilna. We can also talk about collectors in Poznan, for example, and smaller displays elsewhere. But by and large, they're in like the largest cities, at least in the interwar period.
Question is, how hard was it to find information about these collectors?
It varies on the collector. There were some, for example, Goldstein, there's in the Central State Historical Archives in Lviv, his papers are there. So there's actually, I feel, quite a bit. I mean, I'm sure there are many pieces missing. Of course, you can never get a full life's information from the archives, but there was quite a lot about him. But I did have trouble finding other collectors. One person that I'm working on actually for my next project, she was interested in Jewish art, and it was hard to find her. I think some of the reason for that is the circumstances in which people died or were killed, Goldstein among them. But he left some really detailed papers, and he kept his own files very nicely, which I think says something about him as well. But other people, it was a little bit harder to find. It really depended. Somebody like Matthias Berson, it was a little bit trickier to find things about him that really related to the museum, but information about his family is fairly easy to come by because they were such an illustrious Warsaw family.
Since you wrote the book and it's come out, have you heard from any descendants of any of the collectors?
Not yet, but I think I may one day. I would like to. I do think that I came to the work a little bit late to hear from descendants who might be really familiar with like grandparents or great grandparents' work. I do know that Goldstein has descendants in Israel. I have not. From time to time I've also tried to contact descendants. I haven't always been so successful, but I'm very easily findable online. Should anyone want to contact me?
Did any of these museums serve as collecting spots for looted Nazi art, Judaica, and other Jewish cultural items during the war?
Um, Sort of. So I can talk a little bit about the museum in Lviv and also Goldstein's personal collection, which remember sort of he displays his kind of privately. It's open by appointment, and then there's the museum. So the museum collection was so important to note. Lviv is first occupied by the Soviets, so the collections are nationalized before any Nazi activity. So the collection of Lviv Museum is forced into the sort of broader ethnographic arts and crafts museum. Goldstein is permitted to keep his private collection, but it has to be opened to the public. And then when you have the Nazi occupation, there were for the museum in Lviv and also for Goldstein's collection, there were a couple of, I think, really heroic curators who were able to squirrel away bits of the collection elsewhere, kind of in hiding. And I think that's how this Ketubah collection ends up being found rolled up in newspapers, right? This wasn't like a curatorial decision to store them that way. It's about hiding them. In Warsaw, the Jewish Museum, the materials from the Jewish Museum and also archives were confiscated. And it was a little bit unclear to the archivist who was writing about this, where exactly they were created. So they didn't exactly make it into a depot, but they did use it. Some of these, these like Nazi, like Orientalist scholars came to confiscate the works. But some of them end up in other places, like some end up in the National Museum in Warsaw. Sometimes people brought Judaica to the National Museum, which was surprising to the director at the time, but they wanted him to hide it. So things end up in different places, and then it can be tricky unless there's a published catalog to figure out what went where.
I'm going to ask my question. I'm entitled. No. Are there existing catalogs for much of this?
Some. So this catalog here, Goldstein's personal catalog, was reprinted in the 90s by, I think, a publisher in Leipzig. So you can actually, also you can get a PDF online of the original. So that's very convenient. And it's very, very interesting. The catalog of the museum in Warsaw was published. It was published in 1939. So I mean, from our perspective, like quite late. That one, I had seen it mentioned in a publication. I couldn't find it anywhere. I wrote to the scholar who had mentioned it, who said that she thought that she had the only copy, and it wasn't an original. It was photographs of the pages, and then she allowed me to see those photographs. But to the best of my knowledge, there's not like an extant catalog available. Although I'm still not entirely sure about that. Now I have a photocopy of her photocopies, basically.
Did Jewish museums in other countries in Europe meet with more popular success in the Jewish and non-Jewish communities? And I would add a second part to that, which is another question that came in, which was this type of museum and collections unique to Poland?
So in terms of popularity, I'm a little bit less familiar with museums further to the west, but I would say that those were very well known in Poland. And we do have records of some curators from Breslau, for example, visiting the museum in Lviv, and they write kind of in a complimentary way in the guest book. there's some writing in the Jewish press in Poland about the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which opens already after Hitler has come to power. And some of the kind of like reviews of the museum that I read, again, like in the Polish Jewish press, talked about how popular the museum was in comparison to Warsaw's Jewish Museum. Even in the Nazi regime. And the person writing, I don't know that he was correct about this, but his theory about this was that, with the sort of horror, but also fascination about so-called like degenerate art, that probably many of the visitors to this museum were actually Nazis, but maybe they had Jewish roots. This is all speculative on his part, but it does come up a number of times that Jewish museum seems, at least to these Polish observers, to be way more popular than Warsaw's museum. About Jewish museums in the U.S., it's also hard to say without a little bit more research. But I do think that in general, this museum in Cincinnati, which is part of the sort of archival collection today, was, I think, fairly popular. And the Jewish Museum in New York, which comes out of collections from Jewish Theological Seminary, some items from these collections end up there as well.
Notwithstanding the aspirational goal of a Jewish culture museum, was there any concern about looming war and efforts to ship items to America?
There's concern about war. In terms of shipping items to the U.S., there are collectors. There's some that I looked into because I thought that they might be very relevant for this book, and they ended up being a little bit peripheral. Ruja and Benjamin Mintz, who, coming from Warsaw, Polish Jewish collectors, they want their work to be exhibited at the 1939 World's Fair, and it's not. But they ship it there in the hopes that it will be exhibited, and in the hopes that they might find a buyer for their collection. What ends up happening is that they ship their art, they go with it, and this is how they survived the war, is that they were trying to sell off their collection, but in fact they get stuck in New York, which is of course very lucky for them in the end. So there is, I think it can be a little bit tricky, I think, to differentiate between fears of war and what will happen about the collection, and sort of the general economic collapse or at least downturn, but collapse in some circumstances, and this idea that you have to either sell off your collections but maybe find a buyer internally. There's a lot of hand-wringing about just the overall poor situation of Poland, more than there's, I think, a real fear about war as it relates to these collections.
I'm going to make this the last question, because we've gotten a couple of the sort of variations on a theme, but you mentioned afterlife of all of this, and maybe you could spend a little time talking about that.
So I mentioned a couple of cases in Lviv where some of the items show up later. This really continues to happen. For the Warsaw collection, it seems to be a little bit harder to trace, but we do see, for example, this collection of ketubas showing up. In Vilna, it's a different story, which has been sort of widely publicized as well. But I think that we can also find collections from items from Goldstein's collection in the museums of religions in Lviv, which was in the Soviet times the Museum of Atheism. So they had some items from Maximilian Goldstein's collection. In general, the collections were broken apart at least a little bit. It can be a little bit hard to trace them within museums. I think sometimes there's a fear that researchers who are coming in to look at these collections are interested in like taking them back, whatever back means. And so there's sometimes a reluctance, I think, to properly catalog collections. I should also note that some of these collections were destroyed or broken apart during the First World War. So there's this problem as well. I'll show this. This is the picture of the Jewish Community Museum in Lviv. So we have you from the mid 1930s, around the time of its opening. On the left, you can see one of the exhibit halls. And then on the right, this is not the exact same exhibit hall, but it's one of the rooms. On the right, a photograph from 2015 by Asya Gefter. Who was working on a project about this museum. So the building and the rooms are still there. There was a plan to sell the building that I think didn't go through. There's been a call, at least online, to revitalize the museum. I'm not sure that that's going to get much traction, but in some cases you can see like where the museums actually existed. In the case of Warsaw, it's not possible. The building doesn't exist.
And I'm going to ask you a last question. Did any of these collections and objects end up in, say, the Pauline Museum or other Jewish museums?
It's possible. But Pauline Museum doesn't have as many original artifacts as a lot of museums. It is certainly possible. There are objects on display, like in Lviv's ethnographic museum, that come from these collections. But Pauline, I can't be sure, so I don't want to speak out of turn on that.
Well, thank you so much. It's a fascinating topic, and I think you should all out there read the book, Letters from the Afterlife. It's available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and wherever you buy your books. But if you are a member, you get a 10% discount in our shop.yiddishbookcenter.org. But seriously, thank you so much, Sarah, for your work, all that you're doing, and for taking time to visit with us this evening.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks to all of you for joining us. If you're in the area or considering a trip to New England to see the last of our fall foliage, we hope you'll consider joining us at the center this Sunday, October 27th, for our open house, 10 to 4. It's a day of free events in celebration of the launch of our visually stunning 350-page color exhibition catalog, Yiddish: A Global Culture, Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity, and marking the second anniversary of the opening of the exhibition. Lots of stuff planned, very fun, surprises, pop-up performances, and a conversation between me and Chief Curator David Mazzara too. Please check out our full calendar of events because we've got lots of virtual public programs, live events, and screenings, and several book talks taking place in New York, Boston, Montreal, and elsewhere. So view the calendar, register, yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I'd like to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli-Dearden, who makes everything run smoothly. And of course, a huge thanks to all of our members whose support makes our work possible. Please consider becoming a member or giving a gift membership. To learn more, yiddishbookcenter.org. Until next time, thanks for joining us, wishing you all the best, and see you again in our virtual theater again soon. Take care.